We've all read about the parable of the prodigal son, or the missing son. And it's really a great lesson in redemption. It's a great lesson in how far into the world we can go and still have a chance to come back to God. And also highlights, most importantly, as analogies, the compassion and the patience God has for each and every one of us. All of those of God's called, that whatever their trials are, whatever situations they have encountered in life, if they are willing with a whole heart to come back to God, He will accept us if we really desire to seek after Him. So I want to read, if you will, turn with me to Luke 15. Read some of this story of the return of this prodigal son. Luke 15, starting in verse 17. But when he came to himself, speaking of this prodigal son, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants." And he arose and came to his father, but when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and am no longer worthy to be called your son." You see the joy that the father had when he knew his son had turned, and he knew, in this analogy, it was from far off. God knows when our hearts truly change, maybe even before some of our actions show that, before we come to the full choice of turning to God fully. He knows our hearts, and we have made that choice when we are willing to submit back to Him. But with that story, with that great lesson in redemption, that cannot become a standard that we live by if we're trying to become more like Christ. We must not adopt an attitude that we can test God's patience on a continual basis. We cannot become that prodigal son on a monthly, on an annual, on a continual basis and expect that God is going to allow that kind of attitude in our lives. On our part, just assuming, I can just repent at some point with whatever I decide to do, whatever trial or path I decide to take, I can just repent of it at some point, and I'll come back to God when I feel like it. That's not how we grow in understanding of the truth. We grow in understanding of the truth by following after God, not by stretching the bounds and trying to get away from Him. If that is our motivation of trying and testing God like that, at some point our eyes are going to grow dim. Our eyes and our attitude is going to grow complacent. And eventually we will become unable to distinguish between the light of God's truth and the lies of this world. The whole purpose of God allowing us to wander through this world, to have to cut a swath through Satan's deceit in this world, out in this wild, is to test and refine our character, to see how we choose, what we choose in building our relationship with God. Deuteronomy 8, we see why it is that God allows this kind of testing. Deuteronomy 8 and in verse 2, "And you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble you and to test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep His commandments or not." That is the reason we are living amongst sinners, amongst a kingdom and a world ruled by Satan is to test our character, test how much we are willing to follow God. We aren't hermits. We don't live separate away from this world. We live in it. And we prove daily as we are shining lights to this world how we are following after God. You know, if we are learning through this process to keep God's commandments, then we shouldn't be straying from the truth. We shouldn't be pushing the bounds, becoming that annual, monthly, weekly prodigal son to God's truth. We should be learning to stay close to the trunk, not out on the fringes, not out on the limbs. So what did Israel do during those tests? Time after time after time. Well, they forgot God because they ignored his law. They drew close to the world around them and forgot the God that called them. You know, the further we draw away from God, especially those of us that know God, the more likely we are to get stuck out on the branches, under the fringes of what is the truth. And the more unlikely then that we will be even willing to grab hold of the truth, grab hold of that trunk, and have that stability that it gives each and every one of us. You know, in doing so, we wantonly disregard God like Israel so often did. And that attitude of trying and testing God with no real desire to follow after God, to truly desire to be part of God's plan, his family, does not please our Father. Psalm 78. You can see how Israel tested God in this way and what it did in that relationship. Psalm 78, and starting in verse 17. But they sinned even more against him by rebelling against the Most High in the wilderness, and they tested God in their heart by asking for the food of their fancy. So Israel was desiring what they wanted, not what God wanted. Continuing in verse 21, therefore the Lord heard this and was furious. So a fire was kindled against Jacob, and anger also came up against Israel, because they did not believe in God and did not trust in his salvation. And continuing further in verse 56, yet they tested and provoked the Most High God and did not keep his testimonies, but turned back and acted unfaithfully like their fathers. They were turned aside like a deceitful bow, for they provoked him to anger with their high places and moved him to jealousy with their carved images. When God heard this, he was furious and greatly abhorred Israel. That is the kind of attitude that we are going to bring upon ourselves with our relationship with God if we continuously provoke him by thinking, well, I could just change at some point in my own way. You know, there are many branches leading to out on their own in this age. Many people think they have found the true path to reach the truth, to reach a relationship with God, but they are just going further and further away from the trunk, from the safety that affords all of us. As we know, many who knew the truth have left that trunk, have thought they have found stability in other places, and they haven't. They are out on those fringes, and as soon as great winds show up to really test us, those great trials, those branches will snap because they aren't close to the truth. Because we know there is no stability outside of the truth that emanates from God. So, brethren, it is imperative to always test the ground that we lay our foundations on, to always check that we are, with clawing hands, with everything we have, holding on to that trunk, that truth. 1 John 4. Beginning in verse 1. Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits, whether they are of God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world, and that is the kind of world we live in today, full of false prophets, full of false hopes, and full of false ideas. And in verse 2, by this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is of God. And every spirit that does not confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is not of God. And this is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard was coming, and is now already in the world. Well, brethren, we know, as God's chosen, as those that have been set apart, we know what lies ahead of us. So let's make sure that we are prepared to face it.